Why is it that whilst South African football has so much resources, remarkable resources, abundant talent and passionate support of the majority of South Africans, yet it is unable to achieve satisfactory levels of competitiveness locally and internationally? Well, it was exactly that question then that drove my guests to start studying this and doing research in this area. And this started about 24 months ago, and yesterday they launched the research findings. Let me welcome my guest on the line to talk to us about this matter and other issues, of course, that affect the state of football here in South Africa. On the line, I'm joined by Mr. Chris Fortain. He's an academic and project leader. A very good morning to you, Chris.
Good morning to you.
Thank you very much for your time. Also, Professor Henley Moss, academic and researcher at the Northwest University. Professor Moss, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for your time as well. Thanks indeed for coming through. Let me start with Chris. Where did this research project start and why?
Oh, that's a long story, that we've been suffering, or shall we say we've been trying to attempt to address the problems, or shall we say the challenges facing football in South Africa, being that football is the most supported game in the world and obviously a passion for a lot of South Africans. Mm-hmm. Recently, our research has reflected that from a recent FIFA survey, that there are 265 million people in the world that play football. And that's supported by another 5 million referees and officials. So we have 270 people involved in football on a regular basis. And we're speaking about structured football. And that's about a third of the world's population. So we know for a fact that we have people in South Africa, and the majority of the people are passionate about sport, and it appeals to the majority of the people in South Africa. So Mistra in 2010, Mistra, shall I just explain, is a Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Mm-hmm. And they identified 8 strategic thrusts in terms of how it affects service delivery as well as the improvement of lives in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And we must say thank you that Mistra embarked on the issue of a research project in football. And we then consulted with the various, a lot of stakeholders, coaches, players, administrators, old players, new players, young players, to find out what the core is and where is the problem and where does the situation lie. Also, Mistra identified then that after the 2010 World Cup, it was then appropriate for us to see that South Africa becomes a very hub of football development. So this is the whole background to the whole research. We then consulted a few academics who were strong in the research field. My colleague, Professor Henley Moss from Northwest University, has given us very strong strategic direction, and hopefully we can take this process forward. And also one of the leaders in the project was Professor Yoga Kupu, who is an exercise scientist and a biokineticist. So we consulted far and wide in terms of what is really the challenges that we're facing. And our research reflects that it does not mean that there's not anything good and everything is bad about it. We have identified that there are pockets of excellence, but like we say, that there are vacuums in isolated areas within the country, and we need to string these together. This also mooted a move towards SAFA, the South African Football Association, to develop a technical master plan. And a lot of people, and I know a lot of interviews yesterday after the launch was saying, is this just another document that will gather dust on the shelf? And we don't think so, because it is a very practical research and what we term research in action. And hopefully together with SAFA and all the powers that may be within football, we can then try to implement and try and correct the challenges that we face.
All right. Let me go back again then to Professor. Professor, central part of this question was really how football affects the improvement or lack thereof in the quality of life for all in South Africa. And again, I think you'll get questions about what is football to do with the quality of life. How do you answer that question?
Well, football has a lot to do with quality of life because it influences the whole person. It has social aspects, and one of the researchers, Cassie, looked into it specifically in the women playing football, where they are really experiencing football as keeping them safe, helping them with social relationships. They learn how to be disciplined, to stand up for choices, and that reduces risk behavior. So on the quality of life, that's a social aspect as well, but it also creates people living more healthy, because being active changes your physiology. That creates a better health for a person.
Talk to me about the methodology, though, Professor. How did you then research this particular area?
In the football project specifically?
Sure, yeah.
Well, it was a combination of qualitative and quantitative work, and the approach we took was to first try and determine what do we know about South African football. Has there been any research? And from the report that we've launched, you can see that there was very little research. It was spread across the country. It was focused mainly on 12 to 17-year-olds. Here and there was a semi-professional team that they reported on. So in general, very limited research on football, on South African football specific. And I believe because we have a different culture, we cannot always work with international findings, because it is different in South Africa. So we first looked at the literature, and we found there were gaps. And then Chris and Prof. Yoga Kupu's team, they embarked on a few projects, and that was what I reported on yesterday. So it was not all my research, but it was a group of researchers that specifically looked into psychological skills by Professor Leon van Niekerk from UJ, Professor Yanni Ferreira from UJ as well looked into the visual skills of the players. Dr. Leon Latergan looked into the isokinetic strengths. So there were a few projects, and Chris himself, they looked into the management structures to really go and determine where's the lack of information. And that brought out more questions really than answers in this whole situation.
Where are the problems, though? Is it simply an issue of management, or are there problems in terms of how we develop young players in this country? Perhaps I'll just start again with you, Professor.
I think it has a multiple of issues here. One is, I don't think we are addressing the talent identification as we should, and I feel strongly about the physical education that's not very pertinent in the schools anymore. I know it's coming back, but we have to expose children to being physically active at an early age, to a variety of activities, so that they can build like an alphabet of movements, which later on they can develop into skills at a later stage. That's the one aspect. And then Chris can maybe elaborate on the management structures.
Sure.
That came out very strongly that there should be management on a long term, with a long-term strategy, and not change with every new manager or new director coming in, and that there should be discipline in the managerial structures.
Sure. Chris, before you talk a little bit about management, I just want to know from you were there any surprises for you in terms of the findings here, because we've spoken about football in this country over and over again. Were there any things that particularly took you by surprise?
Well, there's quite a few, as you can hear from Prof. Moss's response. There's quite a few that we find that football, after being supported by and played by the majority of the people, has been neglected to such an extent, and has deteriorated in terms of progress. You know, if we look at statistic-wise, without even going onto the field, we see that in 1996, just prior to our birth of our new democracy, we were rated number 1 in South Africa. We won the African Nations Cup. We then, obviously, prior to that, Orlando Pirates won the 1995 Champions League in Africa. And ever since then, we've taken a backslide. We've ended up, it has just deteriorated to the present state that we rank 84th in the world, 16 in Africa. Now, if you see there's teams like Zambia rated above us in 4 and Malawi, then it's quite disturbing to think that 90% of the players in these national teams of other countries are playing in our leagues in South Africa. So it is actually shocking to realize that with all the resources, I'm talking about intellectual resources, I'm talking about human resources, not only finances and other resources. We have the sports scientists in the country, but we're not making use of them. We're always looking abroad and saying, as Prof. Annelie intimated now, we're looking abroad and we cannot draw parallels and say, okay, because in the Netherlands they're doing it this way, we then have to duplicate it in South Africa. We need to understand the culture, where we're coming from, the diversity within our population, And then obviously then interrogate it and say, what is it that we can resolve? As you can see, the topic of this whole research is called the art, philosophy, and science of football.
Mm-hmm.
We know for the fact that football is an art. We admire the Kaizer Chiefs and the Orlando Pirates when they dazzle our wits on the field, the Lionel Messis of this world. It is a philosophy because there's a managerial philosophy about it, there's a coaching philosophy about it, and there's a playing philosophy about it. So that has to be interrogated as to what philosophy are we applying in South Africa. And I think we've gone a bit wayward, and like we said, and we don't have a whole series of continuation. We constantly looking for change, and we're looking for success driven, but yet we change in the whole processes every time. Every time there's a new set of officials coming into SAFA, they change the goalposts. Goalposts move. There's other objectives, there's other directives being changed. There's no long-term strategy.
Sure.
As in, this is the challenges we face, and these are how we're going to resolve them. So also we say that we're not actually trying to bash SAFA, but we're saying that SAFA then has also decided to engage on a technical master plan, which we were very strongly part of, and it's very strongly rooted in our research.
Sure.
In February this year, and this way we assisted them to identify 7 pillars that needs urgent attention. But then obviously is also a challenge to get resources to make sure that these are implemented.
Yeah, but there were interesting things for me that I saw in the report, which I thought, well, perhaps maybe compare South African football players with football players elsewhere. For instance, there's somewhere where you say in the report that only 30% of the sampled players have ever seen a doctor. 76% of the sampled players indicated that they did not receive any food after competitive games or immediately after training, etc. And also there was a higher percentage of injuries sustained in South African studies than those reported in similar age groups from England research. I just thought that that's quite interesting in terms of differentiating between players here in South Africa and elsewhere again, Chris.
Yeah, I think that's more alarming and shocking that the research has shown.
Yeah.
Because when we look at the issues, let me first just further explain that we decided from a research perspective that we cannot look at players that have been developed already. So it was a fruitless venture for us to venture into looking at, analyzing and interrogating what is the makeup of the professional players. Maybe that is research for the future. But we said that the strategy for the development of any country besides football lies within the strength of the youth. They become the future leaders. So we divided the research into 2 parts, where Prof. Hanley and her team looked at grassroots, meaning that motor skill development at the ages between 6 and 12. And we then at the University of Johannesburg looked at the football development of players between the ages of 12 and 20. And in that range, we found alarming issues, because we then looked at structured youth programs. You know, for a fact, in South Africa, today you can take 5 boys or 5 girls and you can form your own academy or your own development structure. It's not regularized. There's no criteria set as how a football development program should look like, and this is where these alarming results come out. So we find that a lot of this attrition of a lot of players between the ages of 14 and 17.
Professor, I'm not sure if this was interrogated. I mean, if you look at countries such as Zambia, who are the champions in Africa today, and compare them to South Africa in terms of their structured development, do they have more structured development? Do they have more investments in terms of their development as compared to what we do?
We didn't investigate that. Chris might know the answer to that from his background. But what we found was that the youth development programs that Chris and them interrogated, because the children often comes from very disadvantaged areas, they lack sufficient nutrition, which influence their development, and that is what predisposes them also to injury and their development in later life.
Chris, in terms of the comparisons?
Well, if there was a comparison, like I said to you, there's a group of players in the Zambian national team now, and most of them play football in South Africa. So they are exposed to other resources that they do not have in their own country. We are, like we said, we are not saying that we do not have that type of players. But if you look at the composition of the PSL teams, we're buying players all over the African continent, and we're not investing in the development of our own youth players. So when we get to a national level, we find that we have a problem. Because all the top players in the country, the top goal scorers, Chris Katonga and the like, are all from different other countries. We're not being xenophobic in the sense, but we are also saying that to strengthen our national junior teams, which have not been successful since they appeared in the World Cup in 2000. So we're 12 years later and we haven't addressed the problem of how do we develop these players so that we can make an impact as a nation in Africa. So that is a comparison. You understand what I'm saying now?
Sure.
So that we find that we won't say that development in Zambia is of a higher level. We say that those players have been identified by South African teams and further developed here.
Interesting. And I'm going to open the lines here on 0891 10428. 0891 10428. Also take SMSs at 34701, 34701, and emails at gwalax@sabc.co.za. But again, Chris, there's something very interesting because there's an SMS that says, what talent? How many South African players are out there competing in the top leagues? How many African Cups, national and club tournaments are you competing in? South Africa is too insular. Now, this is actually a very interesting question because I saw in the findings, specific findings, that one of the things that was mentioned is that a large percentage of youth players in the selected structures of youth football programs in Gauteng did not want to play football in South Africa, but to graduate to professional football leagues overseas, Chris?
You see, isn't that a shocking thing? And I experienced it within my own household because I have a young son that's also very talented. And if you question him and interrogate him and find out, say, what do you think? Where would you like to play? He says, definitely not in South Africa. My vision is either Europe somewhere. And this is 92% of the boys I interviewed in Gauteng alone, 219 boys. And 90% of them says, we don't want to play in South Africa, we want to play abroad. Now, there's a lot of other perspectives that influences this. We're not saying that this is the core is that football in South Africa is rotten. You talk about the economic situation because players overseas earn a lot of money. So you find that the majority of players from South Africa that comes from a disadvantage or a poverty background are using football as an economic gain. We ask them the questions. Firstly, do you think football can improve your financial status? The answer was yes, 92%. We ask them the question that, do you think, why do you think you play football? The first question, the majority of them answered, we want to earn money. So football has been commercialized worldwide. And you see, Europe is supposed to be now the mecca where they're attracting players from Asia, from Brazil, from South America, other countries there. So these young players are saying that we want to then go and compete in Europe. And look, they have a role model one, which is Steven Pienaar. Mm-hmm. But if you track back in 1996 and you look at the 96 team, you'll find that 8 of the players that played in the 96 team that won the African Nations Cup, 8 of them are playing overseas. So when we look at the comparison, we have to compete with the rest of the world, and the highest league in the world is the Champions League. And if you look at the Champions League, you find that all the top players, now FIFA is going to announce tonight, the FIFA 5th Pro 11. Mm-hmm. And you will find that very few Africans are in that team. There's two Africans now, Didier Drogba and Yaya Traore. Not one South African. And what we question that on the Champions League, where all the top players are playing, in Barcelona and Manchester United, there's very few faces from South Africa, or shall we say none.
Yeah.
And then you compare it to Brazilian vision and the philosophy there. They're exporting players by the dozens. You will find that Brazil has 94 players playing in the last 16 in the Champions League. That means they can put a team together, 4 teams together of equal strength.
What about the coaching, though, at basic levels, at youth levels?
That's also a challenge to us at the moment because we do not have youth specialists. I've interviewed in the region of about 16 coaches. And out of the 16 coaches, we have 1 youth specialist. Now, we do not there's something wrong with our coaching structure as well. Because as Prof. Hanley intimated, that we don't have physical education in school. So that means players coming, or potential players with a talent coming up from the younger ages of 6 are not properly physically developed because there's no physical education in terms of balance and physiological makeup and issues like that. So when they reach the ages of 12, now we want to put them through strenuous exercise programs, coaching at over a certain period of hours and things like that because we want to benchmark it internationally. But the base is still faulty. You understand?
Yeah.
So we come now, and now this is why we have such a high injury rate. We find that in two occasions in one of the structured programs that we analyzed, the two players that were coming from rural areas had been playing football without proper equipment for a period of 10 years. Now they are 13 years old. So they haven't been playing with boots, they've been playing in the streets, they've been playing in the dusty fields, hard surfaces, which causes their inner soles or their arches to drop. In the same instance, their hips are being pulled skew scientifically, their spines are being skewed, they're picking up severe pressure in the knees. That's also where their growth spurts, and automatically this talent then just quits the game because the pain is too much.
Right. I will take my updates now, but open the lines as well on 0891104228. Let me read you some SMSs that have come through so far. Somebody says top players are too selfish and are not team players. Bonuses are too high for scoring goals, so individuals go for glory. Another one says they drink too much and they want money, come win or lose. The problem is brain power. Football needs transformation. Football is the opium of the masses, says another SMS. Early childhood football skills development grossly inadequate and confined to Gauteng. South African football below world class but overrated. That's Ndime. Bafana's success reflects the mood and direction of the fortunes of the nation. In 1996, Mandela was president. The people were inspired, says another SMS. Keep them coming. 34701, 34701. I'll also take your thoughts on 0891104228. Let's get your updates. We'll start with the news first with Fabakshni.
Thank you, Xolani. Good morning. COSATU says the march that it has organized today is aimed at sustaining the Labour Federation's campaign against the implementation of e-tolls on Gauteng's freeways. Business is expected to come to a standstill as Gauteng motorists